Well, it's a great privilege to introduce now the Reverend Professor Michael Reiss, who is Professor of Science Education at the Institute of Education at the University of London. He's Director of Education at the Royal Society, Chief Executive of Science Learning Centre, London, Honorary Visiting Professor at the University of York, Docent at the University of Helsinki, that's an interesting one, Director of the Salters Nuffield Advanced Biology Project, a member of the Farm Animal Welfare Council and editor of the journal Sex Education. He has a great many interests, as you can tell. He's a priest in the Church of England, as I've intimated, and Professor of Science Education. So I think without more ado, I'll hand it over.
This is also a presentation that is going to be slightly less academic than some of the other presentations. Part of this is because when Richard got in touch with me, this was part of the brief. It was a chance to reflect on what sometimes being on, as I know a number of other people have been on various committees and so on, what the role of the ethicist or the theologian is and what it feels like. And that, in a sense, is just a series of anecdotes. But I'll preface the anecdotes with a couple of slides to do with some more general issues. So we'll see how the timing goes, but it might be you get me for sort of, until sort of 20 past or something like that, and then 20 minutes of questions. There is usually, in my experience of these things, and I've already noticed one person smiling, one ethicist per working party or equivalent. This is, if it's obviously not a working party set up explicitly to do with ethics, but if it's something where ethics plays a part. And therefore the one person who ends up carrying the label of ethicist, as some of you will have carried labels, whether it can be to do with gender, ethnicity, or particular professional expertise, whatever, know what it's like. The first thing is you deal with all the assumptions from everybody else on the committee or working party about what on earth is this strange being in front of them, the ethicist. And so, being completely honest, I found myself spending quite a bit of time trying, initially with people who don't know me, to appear normal. I can't carry this off with people who do know me. But the first thing is trying to appear non-defensive, because some people who don't have any professional or academic background in ethics have slightly bizarre assumptions, and they sometimes include the fact that they think ethicists are going to only accept one particular viewpoint on the world. So it's something about being open, being able to listen to other people and so on. So it's trying to sometimes slightly water down people's assumptions about ethicists, which occasionally, slightly sadly, includes the assumption that, oh great, we've got an ethicist, he or she will be able to tell us the answer to certain ethical questions, full stop, in the way that I've never quite understood, commutativity in mathematics. I have a quick little explanation about what commutativity means. I now know it. Now, very occasionally, as just about all of us know in ethics, I think there really are answers. I tried to argue for one about whether spitting connects with personhood or not. And I think at the moment there's a consensus it doesn't. But usually ethics, as we know, isn't about that. It's a different sort of reasoning. That leads on to the second bullet point there about how is ethics done. Sometimes you quite explicitly get asked to do little sort of talks on this, but more often it's just that during the series of the working party or whatever, one tries to convey something about, to use the sort of posh term, the discourse of ethics. And usually it's something about trying to articulate the fact that ethics is distinct from many other ways of reasoning, like mathematics or science or aesthetics, but it has certain things in common with them. So, for example, rationality is a part of ethics, but it's not all there is to ethics, just as rationality isn't all there is to most forms of knowledge, etc., etc., etc. So it's something about being prepared to give an account of how one works. Now, the third one I put up, because it's something I feel about rather strongly, it might be thought to just be a bit of a sop, saying, oh, we're all ethicists, so one values everybody's contribution. But I actually believe it much more genuinely and fundamentally that ethics is rather different from mathematics in the sense that many of us are just not very expert in mathematics. Most of us as human beings, part of being human is as one goes through life, one genuinely gets a contextualization of what is appropriate, what's inappropriate, what's morally acceptable, unacceptable, right or wrong. Some people, of course, don't. They plateau, or in some cases, they never actually get going. There aren't very many people like that, thankfully. The vast majority of people have a fantastic amount of embodied wisdom, knowledge about what it is to be an ethicist. And anybody, and again I realise that's probably true of most people here, anybody who talks to so-called lay groups about issues to do with ethics knows, and I can see John nodding back, how wonderful that is. I remember fairly early on being asked occasionally to talk to mothers' union groups or women's groups, who usually consisted of people in their 60s, 70s, who had 60 or 70 years of life of understanding about ethics. And thankfully, I realised my job was not to sort of tell them, you know, this is a good way to have children, or a bad way to have children, whatever sort of thing. It's not about that. So that's quite helpful. And we've already seen that today from people who, you know, modestly saying, I'm not an ethicist, I'm looking forward to your answers, but somebody who works, you know, for years and years and years in issues to do with cancer, with many people who are not going to live much longer. So phenomenal appropriate knowledge. I don't have to now say anything about different ethical frameworks, because Neil really nicely last night went through something about the different range of ethical frameworks, but it is quite important, I find, on working groups to explain to people that we don't have a consensus, that there's one way of understanding what's morally right or wrong. There's a diversity of frameworks. Sometimes one can just leave it as that, but sometimes one needs more explicitly to talk about how different frameworks, a utilitarian framework or virtue ethics or whatever, reaches the same answer, but sometimes reaches a different answer. And then the last two bullet points are, and this is a good thing about people usually meeting face to face, though it can just about be done electronically or by telephone or video conferencing once people have got to know each other. It's about searching for consensus. There's a bit of an academic literature, as some of you may know, about what it is to try and reach consensus. Consensus is not always right, of course. Often people reach a consensus about something which other people or other times come to very different conclusions. But it's something about struggling and wrestling as best one can to achieve an agreement among a group of people, which then gets tested out. It's not, of course, the same as majority voting, and not always, but sometimes, if things have to go to votes, it can be an indication of one extreme of democracy and openness and transparency, but another extreme of an inability to reach a consensus through negotiation. And of course, lastly, and this is particularly true of contentious ethical issues, sometimes you can't reach a real consensus, so the value is in the dialogue. And the dialogue really does shape things and changes things. Because Rodney kindly read out everything I do. One of the things I work in is sex education, and this is an area where many people assume that you couldn't get agreement on certain things. And the classic thing is usually things like, well, what sort of sex education program do you have in a secondary school when there's a range of parents from different backgrounds? My experience, without exception, has been you can always get agreement on what sort of sex education program to have in a school as soon as you get parents, you give them a chance to come together and discuss it. And 95% of the assumptions and the fears and the worries totally dissipate, and people end up being comfortable about there are some things where they can state their point of view, and in a minute amount of cases they want their son or daughter to be removed from the class for particular things, but in the great majority of cases dialogue leads helpfully to a way forward. And many of us, of course, professionally work in areas where you have got to come up with an answer. This is not just an academic exercise, and I don't, of course, working as an academic, consider academic to be a term of abuse. I don't like it as a term, but I mean in the sense that in a professional setting, you have got to reach certain conclusions. Because somebody, was it John put me on the spot, I wasn't going to say anything about public and private morality, I sort of thought, crumbs, I'd better think a tiny bit about that. And of course, this is all about the public domain. And what I tend to find, again, this is just common sense for most of us, is that if trust builds up in a group of people trying to reach a common position which can be articulated and defended publicly, people often will end up saying their own personal views, even when they know they're in a minority, provided they feel sufficient trust has built up. And that, of course, is especially valuable, because if that's the case, that's how other people learn and listen, and things do shift, and also means all of us in the group tend to feel heard, and so on. Okay, so that's a bit about being, I think, often the one ethicist, when any of us is, on a working party or equivalent. There are usually fewer than one revs stroke equivalents, and I hope you'll accept this rather loose use of language, by which I mean somebody whom it is assumed can either bring theological knowledge or say something theologically about an issue. Sometimes people still do have one per working party, but as I say, often they don't. So when one finds oneself on a working party or a committee or anything like that, there are even more assumptions, of course, about reverence and analogues of reverence. So anybody with theological training or ministerial expertise in any of the world's religions. And I probably don't need to start going through all sorts of stereotypes, but you know, many of the assumptions about people who are ordained make ethicists look like balanced, respectable, sensible, wise people. That having been said, of course, I don't think we'll need here much discussion about this. Religious perspectives are so incredibly important in many of the contentious ethical issues of the day. I've given a couple of blatantly obvious particular examples, one of which, of course, we've had rather nicely discussed already today, embryonic stem cells. And another one which I thought was less likely to have been discussed, so I'll say a bit about it later, so-called religious slaughter, which I ought to explain if you haven't come across the phrase before, is of non-humans. I'll clarify that a bit later. But even within the Royal Society, where I now work, I find, of course, that both among fellows of the Royal Society and staff of the Royal Society, there are some who just assume that we genuinely live in a sort of post-religious age, and then they get rather irritated and frustrated when idiots seem to not accept some scientific advance for some sort of silly reason to do with religious issues. So even on just the particular aspects like these, there are reasons for being able to take account of religious perspectives. And then anyway, this links in with the worldviews perspectives, as most of us again are very well aware from the lives we all live. If one has a religious faith, it tends to be an integral part of who one is, which manifests itself in one's actions, one's thoughts, one's beliefs, one's practices, even if one isn't talking about a particular issue, which is considered by those who don't have religious faith as possibly having a religious significance, like euthanasia or something like that. So being a religious person is of extreme importance. Now, the worldviews, I don't know how many of you have seen, this is just trying to make a point through illustration, I don't know how many of you have seen the March of the Penguins, which, has anybody seen the March of the Penguins? Right, so it's only 3 of us, 4 of them, actually. March of the Penguins is the best-selling documentary of all time, from the natural history documentary of all time. And it shows these wonderful emperor penguins, which are some people know around Antarctica, in the most way which just looks so engaging, sort of plod, because of course they don't fly. Although I hope some of you saw the 1st of April. Rather good, high-quality little BBC 90-second spoof video with penguins flying off from Antarctica with a bit of difficulty at first to the rainforests of the Amazon. But back to real life. The March of the Penguins is a superbly related National Geographic documentary which talks about the life of penguins. So it's a sort of a la David Attenborough, though it wasn't David Attenborough who narrated it. It's quality, objective natural history. Very interestingly, when one watches it, it is slightly more explicit than most natural history programs are about evolution. Most natural history programs cannot be explicit about evolution because they won't sell well in the USA. And so they just don't mention it. They don't get into that. They can talk about adaptation, but they don't overtly talk about things happening so many hundred millions of years ago. This one does. It talks about in the past, Antarctica was forest, wooded, and it's got quite a little bit about plate tectonics. I was quite surprised when I eventually saw it. And the reason I was surprised is because, as some of you may know, March of the Penguins has been seized upon by the American conservative Christian right as a wonderful example of intelligent design. And if you read the various blogs that you can obviously easily access just by doing searches on the internet, there is wonderful, wonderful stuff which probably all of us could completely understand whether or not we happen to inhabit an evolutionary worldview, which I do. My PhD was in evolutionary biology, about people who have seen this documentary and see it as an example of God's design. And the worldview's perspective is one that I find quite helpful for seeing how each of us, myself included, sees the world through a particular lens or set of lenses. So in my case, my lens is partly shaped by having had a quite good science education, including evolutionary biology, and partly, of course, by being somebody with a fairly conventional Christian faith. That also leads into the last little point, which I would almost never start explicitly discussing in a working group, because terms like postmodernism tend to attract so many assumptions of what one means. But again, somebody, I've already forgotten who it was, briefly mentioned postmodernism today. It was John again. Well, you see, I really like the way that John did it, John Brown, because postmodernism, if one is interested in having discussions with people who are very intelligent but don't have religious worldviews, which is what often happens in these sort of working groups, postmodernism is incredibly useful because it has allowed people to be, exactly as John said, more suspicious of a single meta-narrative about the world. That includes suspicion about a singular secular meta-narrative. So a lot of people who themselves have no religious faith, I think, are now slightly more open than they were 20 years ago to the possibility of at least, sometimes grudgingly, but at least admitting the validity of the articulation of a religious viewpoint. And not just the articulation of it, the expression of it, but expecting in some sense that others are not going to ridicule or ignore it. So that's my positive framing about postmodernism and the way it allows each of us to feel, well, I don't think the rest of the world can just ignore my position. I can state it and expect to some extent it will be taken account of. Okay, we now just go into a series of increasingly incoherent stories. Okay. Those of you who are academics will know, particularly if you live in the United Kingdom, that the various research assessment exercises have been quite a strong influence on the writing that academics do. Back in about 1991 or so, I wrote a 1,500-word article for a newsletter called the Humane Education Newsletter. This is exactly the sort of article that one is not supposed to be writing because it's too short, 1,500 words, it's not an academic journal, it's a newsletter. And it had a really good effect for my subsequent both academic career and indeed interest in life. Because it happened to be read, I'd been asked to write it, and it happened to be read by somebody who was a reader in philosophy and philosophy of education called Roger Strawn, who had been sort of vaguely looking for the last 9 months for somebody who was a biologist, but who was sensitive to philosophy and theology. And I had used the argument in this newsletter, ye are of more worth than many sparrows, for a very middle-of-the-road position about non-human animals are of value, but loosely speaking, they're not as valuable as humans. So what seems to me to be a fairly common-sense position, but it was put in writing, and Roger thought, this looks like the sort of person it might be worthwhile pairing up with. So I got this pre-email, I think, I got this rather odd letter saying, you know, shall we meet up? And I wasn't quite sure I was meeting up. And then at the end of the coffee, he told me, and we got on superbly and wrote a book together. And Roger was, because he wrote already in this area from a philosophical perspective about plant biotechnology, some of you will know, Roger got invited as an expert for the first ever United Kingdom consensus conference. If you don't know, a consensus conference is when a group of so-called lay people, in other words, people who are not meant to have particular subject expertise, are brought together intensively for just a few days, and at the end of it, expected to come up with some sort of either judgment or report about a rather technical issue. And this first one, which only cost a total of about £80,000, was held, I think from memory, at the Science Museum. And they met these people, they came for a number of pre-meetings, and then they met for 3 days, and they summoned loads of witnesses. And before the 3 days, they'd got lots of experts to come and talk to them about things, and I was dragged along because of Roger as the so-called theology expert. And it was really interesting because I wasn't down, no one was down, as a so-called theology witness. The people who'd been identified by the organisers as the witnesses of the 3 days were all scientists. And I'm glad to say they got called. But the so-called lay people thought, no, we don't want just the scientists, we want lots of other people to come and talk to us. One of whom was a theologian. Well, sort of theologian, it was me anyway, it was the nearest thing they knew to a theologian. I mean, you know, because I said that it was because of Roger that I got involved with it. The thing that is most interesting about that report, which is a very good report produced on plant biotechnology, which frankly still stands up 14 years later, as somebody will know, is the government minister who turned up on the last day. And I've got a little bit of sympathy with him because it's the first time it's been done, and he'd obviously been rather sort of informally briefed, and so he was fairly honest, which was the mistake. Because what he said, of course, what he said quite genuinely was, you know, thank you ever so much for all your hard work, it's been fascinating, but we won't be taking any account of this in setting government policy. And you won't be amazed to know that a group of people who've just emotionally, intellectually invested themselves to the best of their ability to do something rather good weren't very impressed with this. And thankfully, nor were some of the journalists who were there, for whom this was vastly more interesting when they wanted to write it up than some rather highly techie issues about labelling of, you know, plant materials and so on. So that actually itself has had quite an effect, which I'll come back to, about how in public policy one takes account of so-called lay expertise. This one's really brief. Some of you will either know personally or know the work of Robert Plomin. He's the person who, more than any other, researches the extent to which there is a genetic underpinning to human intelligence, or if you don't like that phrase, the extent to which there is a heritable component to cognitive performance, which there is. I mean, we can talk about this more in detail, there's no doubt whatsoever. But it's all very contentious, as again many of you will know. It was even more contentious 10 years ago. And he kept on suddenly putting in all these research proposals to the MRC, which cost £1.5 to £3 million per proposal. And this was before the days of full economic costing. So in today's money, given inflation and full economic costing, these are all £5 million, and they're all rather good. But they couldn't fund most of them, A, because there wasn't the money, and B, because they were terrified of what on earth the reception would be. So they rather oddly set up a so-called expert working group on behavioural genetics. And because my PhD was in evolution biology and population genetics, and because I then thought to know something about ethics, I ended up being on it. And the reason I put it in here was because it was fascinating, because it was about the only time I've been on a working group whose only function, and this is perfectly healthy, I don't think this is a bad function, whose only function has been to protect the funding, the parent organisation. It was quite definitely, I think almost explicitly, set up, are we going to fund this research or not? They didn't want us to do a second set of scientific reviewing. That had already been done, and bluntly speaking, the reviewers had been rather positive about quite a lot of these proposals. It was just thinking, look, what's the general public and others going to think if the MRC suddenly starts putting quite a lot of its money, because as I said, these were big grant proposals, and there were several that looked good, in this area. And roughly speaking, they went ahead and funded several of them, and they had been quite controversial, though my own view is we've learned a lot of very, very valuable stuff. If you want to know one specific thing we've learned, which is different to what I'd expected, I thought we would find that a relatively small number of human genes between them had actually quite a big effect on cognitive performance in humans. And the short answer, I mean, that's what you find in almost everything in genetics, and I'm aware there are several people who do know more about genetics than I am, so you can interrupt violently or add comments at the end. But in most things in genetics, when there are several loci, several places on the DNA of different chromosomes that affect a trait, such as height in plants or various things to do with colour or whatever, you tend to find that a small number of genes account for quite a reasonable proportion of the variance. You don't find that with human intelligence. You find, of course, there are certain chromosome mistakes which have big effects on human intelligence. But when you talk about individual genes, is a lot of them, and the reason is there are an awful lot of our genes working in the brain, probably. And a lot of genes that are working in the brain are still very important for cognitive performance. Okay. The next one I thought I'd say a bit about was something called the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes, which I really enjoyed being on. This is, at one point, one of those really unexciting committees that never got into the sort of public domain whatsoever, because what it was supposed to do was look at any applications, as is suggested, for novel foods or processes. So when you got some exciting suggestion about how to heat treat apricots in a different way, we dealt with those sorts of big issues. But this just happened to be the same time as GM foods were getting going. So in fact, the entire work of the committee for the 4 years I was on it became absolutely subsumed by issues to do with GM foods. And it was this terribly interesting time when the European Union, one of the times when Britain's been in agreement with the mainland, the European Union had more or less decided we don't want GM foods in Europe. Whereas, of course, the USA was producing rather large amounts of them. And I found it interesting because it wasn't anything to do after a while, though I was actually officially the ethicist on this committee. It wasn't really about ethics at all. It was an entirely political situation where more and more fine-grained detail was being required of the companies submitting these bids if it was to do with GM food. And they often wouldn't be rejected, but they'd sort of bounce back for yet more and more detail. So you'd often find that going back to the sort of heat treatment of apricot excitement, you'd end up having, might go back once or twice, wodge of sort of 8 or 10 pages, 2/3 of them get accepted, 1/3 get rejected, fairly objective reasons why they get objected, like, you're not doing as much pressure as you used to, we want some definite proof showing that doesn't harm mice or something like that, or whatever. Whereas you'd get these, eventually got them all shredded because I just, my room wasn't that big of work. But the size of the piles you'd end up getting, and the unfair thing was it only became the Unilevers and firms of that sort that could put in the applications. And I can see John, and others of you who know about these things, Joe nodding, because the cost was just appalling. And everything then gets into a little world of its own, because committees develop these sort of rules for how they judge things. So you'd sort of have these rules which got almost subconsciously, on a case-by-case basis, built up as to the sort of data you'd want before you eventually said yes. And the other thing to mention about this committee was that at the same time we had, does somebody remember the push tie experiments? This was a chap who, I know one shouldn't say these things, it sound a bit ageist, but he wasn't in the first flush of his research career, who did these experiments which really weren't terribly well controlled, if one's honest. But they were partly described by him and his colleagues and widely reported as showing very harmful effects of genetic modification, when it actually became very difficult to sustain this, so all the expert scientists told us. And at one point we had 5 separate official investigations of push dye going on in this country, one of which was the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes. And it was the only time that things got reasonably political. And I thought it was great fun because I managed to get a grant at one point, because I'm mainly in science education, from the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, who, and this is official, it's not hidden knowledge, but they're the charitable arm of the Sainsbury family, because the Sainsbury family put a huge amount of money into various charities. And the grant that I got, which was fairly large for the time, was £168,000, was all about helping primary teachers, 100 of them, to themselves carry out a little investigation in science so as to better understand what science is all about, so as to get their primary children to do little investigations in science. It was all rather good, actually. Because, of course, most primary teachers haven't gone through a science degree, so they've never done a little science project investigation themselves. All they'd ever done was the sort of very small things that they then get their 7 or 8 or 9-year-olds to do. So this was a chance to expect them to do a bit more, and it was all a lot of fun. But it got portrayed as, the ethicist on this committee getting money from the minister, because of course David Sainsbury. was at the time minister, sort of thing. So it was absolutely marvellous. So I was accused of corruption, which is really, some might have thought something much more interesting than I'd ever been before, sort of thing. And the civil service is very good in those situations. They suddenly spring into sort of overload about first the absolute panic for 12 hours, whereas they check if you have done anything you shouldn't have done, or if you hadn't signed all the right bits of paper and everything, or hadn't declared something as an interest, and then they're very good. Okay. This one I put down because Europa Bio was a different sort of committee. It was one set up by the umbrella organisation for European biotechnology companies. And they set up an external advisory group on ethics, which they hoped would meet a couple of times to approve their code of ethics. And they got, I think it was 7 people, one from each of 7 different European countries, not all the European Union, one of them was Switzerland. And they thought a couple of meetings we'd be able to approve their code of ethics. And of course it took us 2 years to, because there's nothing with group ethics like more than the chance to meet in Brussels, a really nice meal, and then discuss ethics the next day. And it was very good because what it showed was the function of ethicists in a sort of teaching situation, which again I imagine many of you will be doing. Because in a sense, to draw up a code of ethics, you have to get the people, in this case the organisations, to get some sort of buy into it. And they would put down things which they just thought were trivially obvious, like respect human life. And, you know, roughly speaking, the 7 ethicists would nod and say it was a great meal last night. What do you mean by respect human life? I mean, it's all pretty mainstream stuff in medical ethics, but you gently were trying to check this out. And we ended up agreeing a code of ethics which actually was some use, in that it was a bit more clear-cut about certain things that the companies who signed up to it would not do, and other things that they would commit themselves to doing. It also showed me, as anybody will know who's worked on international collaborations, that one of the great things about international collaborations is the extent to which you find out that some of the stereotypes about people from different cultures are valid, and the extent to which some of them are not valid. And so, for example, on the mainland in Europe, there is in some countries very strong belief in human dignity as one of the core values, ethically. And whereas in the Scandinavian and in England, so very, very good ethicists, there was from Denmark, and I would sort of start saying, yeah, what do you mean by human dignity? Can you give me an example? And other people for whom it was like a sort of core concept, and they could give instances where someone's dignity was being flouted or not, but they, and I'm not doing a very good job now defending a different perspective, but the point is that there are different cultural assumptions about what are core ethical points of principle. Some of you will have had grants from the BBSRC, I know very much indeed. And this is relevant for a number of reasons, one of which is that the BBSRC is one of the research councils in the United Kingdom which gives money to biologists and others who do work of fundamental importance in the biological sciences. And rather wisely, the previous chief executive, but one, set up this little expert group in response to public concern, because he had realised in the mid-90s, as all of us had, that there had been various sort of problems to do with biology, the most obvious one being BSE and CJD, and he thought it'd be good to have some sort of almost a sounding board to give him some advance notice of this. I think it's fair to say somebody who didn't have any background in ethics or anything like that, and rather fortunately, at the very first meeting of this group, he and I had a blazing row, because he took the position that you couldn't possibly think it was necessary to label genetically modified foods, because all the scientific evidence was that GM foods were just as safe as non-GM foods. And eventually, I think I managed to succeed in arguing with him that even though I held the view that the evidence suggested that, if anything, GM foods were probably safer than some non-GM foods, that didn't mean logically that we shouldn't label, because labelling was all about allowing choice, and that was simply a different category from human safety. And that one of the things that ethics could do would be to value a category of human choice, and we can dress it up in language like autonomy and consent and so on, rather than just privileging everything within a framework of safety. And of course, eventually, I think he really understood the point I was making, and rather grudgingly accepted it. But the healthy thing was, because it was an academic argument, even though he felt he'd lost it, he was able to accept that maybe an ethicist could put a point of view that might be useful to the BVSRC. The other useful thing about that group, which has nothing to do with me, was it helped clarify for BVSRC the role of so-called lay expertise, going back to what I said about the consensus conference. Because the BVSRC put two sorts of people on that group. There were the people like me who were no longer scientists, but had a sort of scientific background and knew a bit about biology, and were now supposed to have expertise in a different area. And that included some very good sociologists. Some of you may or may not know someone like Brian Wynne, for example, who did superb work about sheep farmers in Cumbria and their understanding to do with radioactivity and things like this. But it also included some people who were, if you like, the real lay people. They were not supposed to have any particular expertise, whether in sociology or ethics or anything else. And their role was supposed to be just to ask the questions, but why? But I don't know if any of you have found this in any sort of similar groupings you've been on. It doesn't eventually work very much, because you get a polarization where eventually people end up talking in a rather technical shorthand, which is either rather frustrating or feels patronizing to people who don't live in that sort of world. So you can't, every single time, go through again all the advantages and disadvantages of utilitarianism versus virtue ethics, as Neil did for us last night, if you're only meeting 3 times a year for 3 hours. You've got to get onto some real concrete. So people talk in shorthand, in a sense, and that's sometimes quite difficult. So one of the things, actually I'll just move on a couple for a second, and then I'll come back. One of the things that the BVSRC has wrestled with more recently, that still hasn't quite made up its mind, is whether it would be better to have lay expertise at a much higher level. And I've argued that the council of the BVSRC is where you ought to have so-called lay expertise, because that's where you're looking at the really big general issues, not the ones that require specific technical expertise. But as I say, I think I've probably lost that battle, if I'm honest, but it's an interesting one we pushed on. Okay, last few examples now. Bourne Hall, as some people know, is an IVF clinic, and it has an ethics committee. It has, of course, a research ethics committee. I haven't got anything on these about research ethics committees. This is a different sort of ethics committee. This is a clinical ethics committee, which doesn't, in IVF clinics, have any formal authority. It simply advises the director, and the director uses it at Bourne Hall to bring so-called problematic cases. So when I first joined it, which was by now 8 years ago, almost all of the issues were to do with surrogacy. This, of course, is just about how ethics shapes over time. Earlier on, they've been often about the fundamentals of IVF anyway, some of the issues we've been talking about earlier today. But they had reached a view on that, whether or not IVF fundamentally was acceptable or not, and various things internally about how many embryos should be replaced and what should happen to other embryos, and so on and so on and so on, how much notice, a lot of which has now been subsequently codified across the country through the HFEA. But when I joined it, the big question was always to do with surrogacy. So some people know this is where, supposing I and the person who's my partner want to have a child, but in my case, female partner for whatever reason, and this could be simply a medical one, like she's had a hysterectomy rather early on in life, can't herself carry the child for the 9 months of pregnancy, when is it acceptable for another woman to be the surrogate? And this country has had what some people, myself included, think is a very rather positive history of practically no cases where at the end of the whole procedure there's been some sort of a crisis, by which I mean things like either the surrogate mother saying, I'm not going to hand over the baby, or the commissioning couple, to use the language, suddenly saying, well, we don't want that baby. Those would be the two most obvious sort of crises. And a lot of professional expertise is built up about the sort of checks you put in place first of all to reduce the likelihood of that. And a lot of it is very concrete stuff and involves rather high quality counselling, establishing why the person wants to be a surrogate. And there are various almost rules that are now built up. So you've had to have had some children already, but they can't still be too young. You've got to be a certain age, but you yourself can't be more than a certain age, which is edged up. I'm not sure what it is now. I think it might even be 42 now. When I started, it was 35. So that's, again, is what happens often in case law. You build up a case law and things get more or less understood and accepted. But I thought I'd mention that the current issues, the one that was about 2 years ago, was the contentious one, was lesbian couples. Bourne Hall has now moved to a position where that is happening routinely. It's happening infrequently, because there aren't that many lesbian couples who want a child through IVF, but it's happening routinely. What the clinic did, which I thought was rather well done, was it came to the ethics committee before it had had any couples coming wanting treatment. So it's fairly obvious this thing was going to happen, just because we all hear in the news so often about either two men wanting a baby, as was mentioned earlier, or two women wanting a baby. Then, of course, we looked rather carefully at the research evidence, because one of the arguments against lesbians having children was one to do with, well, what would the children be like psychologically? And as some of you will know, there's now a lot of rather hard, high-quality empirical data about the psychological state of children brought up by two women. And the shorthand answer is they're slightly more stable and normal and achieve better academically than the average child, which actually politically isn't that surprising when you really think about the average lesbian couple, who tend to be rather well educated, highly intelligent, have thought a huge amount about having children. But the point was, it somewhat allayed the fears of others. And it's been very interesting that even the sort of tabloid newspapers have shifted hugely in the last 5 years in the extent to which they've accepted the idea of lesbians having children through IVF. Okay. House of Lords Select Committee on Animals and Scientific Procedures. This was a select committee which ran for quite a long time, 18 months, that's quite long for a select committee, which was set up to re-examine what some of you will know very well because of your work, what's called the Animals in Scientific Procedures Act, brackets 1986. This is the act which regulates the use of animals in any sort of experiments, whether they're academic experiments or whether they are contract research, testing a different sort of pesticide. Very briefly, definition of animal is only vertebrates plus octopus, rather interestingly, and there are certain age checks. If you're very young, as a fish embryo, for example, you don't come within the act and so on. But Parliament does this every now and again, which is have a look at an act, in this case about 15 years after it had been set up, see how it was running. And the committee, I was the so-called specialist advisor to the committee for the 18 months, and it was superbly chaired. And I thought this was really interesting from an ethics point of view. The chair, who was somebody called Lord Smith of Clifton, had previously been a professor of either politics or political philosophy, I can't remember which, in Queen's University, Belfast. So it had his entire working life through the Troubles in Northern Ireland, working academically and living where careful use of language and understanding of different viewpoints was central. And he was fantastic. And one of the things that was so interesting was his determination to get every possible perspective on the issue, which being an academic I rather liked, but it did mean it went on a long time. And we just got so many witnesses. And this is, I I think it's okay to say it all now. I hesitated a tiny bit, but because I know we're being filmed on, which is quite a few years now, and became known by the committee, though not known outside the committee. There were even one case when he got me and nobody else to meet somebody who we know would not be acceptable to the whole committee because of this person's history in objections to animal experiments, because he really wanted to try to get to understand the point of view of this person. And he had the sort of strength of character to then tell the rest of the committee what he'd done, some of whom were absolutely livid with him, but then, of course, rather interested to know what on earth did this person say, and he got fed in. The other things I thought I mentioned about that to do with ethics in the public domain was how the committee would react to people. They were one of I don't know if you, some people know how these things operate. They sort of see people for often only 20 minutes. It's terribly short. Fire a load of questions at them. There are professional stenographers who write down every word, and then it goes to the clerk and to the specialist advisor who end up framing it into draft reports and so on. One of the people they were most impressed, even though they all completely rejected her arguments, was someone called Michelle Fu, who at that time was the director of the British Union for the abolition of vivisection. Because she argued strongly that any experimentation on sentient animals was ethically unacceptable because they hadn't given their consent. And she was giving exactly the same criteria for what should be acceptable for our use of non-human animals as for our use of humans, as in research on children, say, and so on, who can give proper proxy consent, etc., etc. And as I said, the little chips rejected her argument, but they respected at least there was an ethical consistency. The people they couldn't stand were the ones who claimed that we didn't learn anything useful from experiments in animals, because they were wonderfully diligent. I mean, I completely changed my view about the hereditary peerage, if I'm honest, because we ended up with this fantastic situation where one of the hereditary peers was able to contradict validly and correctly the government's, the top civil servant in the Department of Health, by quoting from papers written by some of his scientists earlier on, because this peer had read so much of the stuff that the clerk and I had put in front of them and so on. This was about, I don't know the technicalities, but it was about, roughly speaking, how useful is the information we learn from animal experiments, because you can sort of backtrack. You can imagine, supposing you hadn't had the information, what would have been the likely rejection rate at the next stage of clinical trials, blah, blah, blah. Right. Joe was rather involved with all of this. Are you going to say anything about the GM story and the field trials and so on tomorrow?
Not much about the field trials, no.
Very wise, very wise. I think I'll follow your advice. And go straight on to the one anecdote about that. I'll give you the complete anecdote in that case. This was chaired, as Joe and I know, by David King, who's the government chief scientist. So it couldn't have been higher level. The deputy chair was a lovely man who tragically died only a few months ago, Howard Dalton, who was the government's chief scientific advisor in DEFRA. It just polarised. It was absolutely fascinating. David King is a very good chair. The meetings were interminable. They always called more meetings. I've forgotten, were you on the actual meetings, or were you the person who came and gave the expert input? That's what I thought. Oh, you're lucky. They just went on and on forever. And the reason was that it was just such a polarised group. And in the end, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, when it came to the press launch, the only people whom David King would have sitting on the panel before the press were himself, Howard Dalton, and the only two non-scientists on the panel. He decided that all the scientists were so much in one position or the other that he was worried how they'd come across the media. Now, he happened to agree with the majority of the scientists, who just kept on saying, look, you know, Joe can give the details he wants to, but it's all about the extent to which the field trials affect or don't affect biodiversity in various crops and things like that. And then a small number of scientists who it seemed as if, irrespective of the data, they just wanted to ban GM crops. So, right, the last one I'll say is Farm Animal Welfare Council, because I said I'd say a tiny bit about the cheerful subject of so-called religious slaughter. If I'm asked what I think are the three big sort of ethical, well, nobody asked me this, but I tend to just say it. If I'm asked what I think are the three big ethical problems in the world, one of them has already been alluded to today. It is to do with human inequality and what happens as a result of that inequality and what it's like to live with extreme inequality. And that can be inequality of all sorts of things, inequality of opportunity of education, for health, etc., etc., etc. The other two are to do primarily with non-humans, in my view. One of them is to do with extinction rates, which, as you probably know now, roughly speaking, 3 orders of magnitude higher than they've ever been. That's, in my view, therefore, one of the 3 big ethical issues. And the third one is the treatment of intensively reared farm animals, which is why I'm quite glad I'm on the Farm Animal Welfare Council, again, as the so-called ethicist. And what I'm trying to push for on the Farm Animal Welfare Council is getting a fundamental criterion for what is acceptable for keeping animals in the UK, which is a life worth living, in the identical sense in which it's used, as was referred to once earlier today, in the medical literature. In other words, accepting in notion that there is the possibility that some farm animals do not have a life worth living. My own personal view, having spent rather too many hours now going around watching animals being slaughtered, and some intensively reared chickens in particular, is there are rather large numbers of animals, thankfully a small proportion, but because the numbers are so big, you know, we're talking about across Europe thousands of millions of mammals being killed for food each year. Because the numbers are so big, even as a small portion, there are large numbers of animals that I don't think have had a life worth living. The religious slaughter is incredibly interesting because religious slaughter is the phrase that's used within different government to allow the Muslim and Jewish community, if they wish to slaughter without pre-stunning. So the Jewish and the Muslim community say this is the most humane way, at least some would do, of killing animals, because the animals are handled in very low throughput numbers. The people who do the slaughter, particularly the shaket in the Jewish system of shakita, are extremely well trained compared to your average slaughter person. I've never met a female one in my life, but slaughter person. But the idea, as you probably know, and apologies to anybody who finds these sort of details, you know, are a bit off-putting, and I really hope you enjoy your dinner. You cut across the animal's throat, and then there's a loss of blood, which leads to a period of unconsciousness, and then obviously death. This is one of these things where, within the Farm Animal Welfare Council, because most people who are on it are vets, and people who know rather a lot about animals, and are not particularly sympathetic, I'm afraid, always to Jewish and Islamic viewpoints, they're very unkeen on religious slaughter, very unkeen indeed. And I found myself really interesting because I sort of had to wrestle with myself whether my job is to simply push for the animals, where I think probably you would want to either ban or certainly reduce the amount of so-called religious slaughter, or whether it's to think, oh yes, but all ethics always takes place in a context. And I know, going down the consequentialist line of reasoning, that if we produce a report, we're producing the so-called white meat slaughter report at the moment, chickens mainly, and you know, other poultry like ducks and turkeys and a few geese and rather oddly rabbits, and I do realise they're not poultry. If you produce a report that says ban religious slaughter, the net effect, because it won't be accepted by the government, there's zero chance, we know that, the net effect will be to increase the number of animals in this country killed without pre-stunning, because about 85 to 90% of the poultry that are classified as halal, in other words holy, suitable for Muslims, are pre-stunned in this country. But most Muslims don't know that. It's more expensive, you see, if you don't do pre-stunning, because you have to have the lower throughput numbers. So if there became a big furore about it, you don't need to have an academic background in sociology and psychology to know that what will happen is immediately there'll be a lot more Muslims thinking, I didn't know that. we're going to have to have a few fewer chickens, but we'll start paying the £8 or £10 rather than the £4 per chicken, and at least we'll know they've been properly slaughtered. So it's quite interesting on consequentialist grounds what the best way forward is for this one. Right, as I said, series of anecdotes, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
That's great, thank you very much, Michael. Now, any questions? About a quarter of an hour. Yeah, Simon.
Do you think people like Jamie Oliver sticking his oar in is for or not?
Very, very. I have a huge belief in people sticking their oar in.
Can you explain the question?
Jamie
A
Oliver.
lot of people won't understand.
So Jamie Oliver, or Jamie Oliver as I call him, because I don't exactly know him, is a very well-known celebrity cook who has got passionately engaged about the quality of school food, first of all, and secondly, about animal welfare issues. And I'm really in favour of it. Now, of course, in one sense, in public policy, you wish somehow it all happened a bit more gradually, because the latest programmes by, it wasn't just Jamie Oliver, what's he called? Hugh Sternley-Whittington? That's right. They led, of course, immediately to a rush for demand for organic, free-range chickens in the supermarkets. Yeah, well, these things take 42 days to get from hatching to slaughter, you know. So, if only they'd been a bit more known 9 months ago, we would have been able to gear up slightly more people producing them, because otherwise you just end up with rather frustrated people who say, well, I tried to buy organic once, and there wasn't one in the supermarket, so I've gone back to intensively reared ones. So, but broadly, I'm really in favour of them. What was behind your question?
I was just wondering, sometimes when things get taken by the media,
Yeah.
they start snowballing in
Yeah.
areas that the
I like snowballs.
experts,
Yeah, I mean seriously, sometimes it's the one way to get things done. I mean, he's managed to get an extra £200 million a year, I think it is, spent on school meals. I mean, I work in education, you know. I've never achieved anything like that in life. So, you know, I do think these sort of people, they can catch the time. I'm really positive, as you can tell. Seriously.
Good, all right. Go.
I've got to ask. Why do octopus?
Oh yeah.
specify?
The academic answer is they're bright. And if you do any sort of anybody who's worked with octopuses in an animal behaviour situation, you know they're probably pretty similar to dogs in terms of IQ. I mean, loosely speaking, IQ. You know, capacity for reasoning. I must talk with you later, but you're nodding like mad. They're just wonderful. So, but how on earth politically somebody, whether it was Martin Wells who works on octopuses, somehow somebody must have got them in, I don't know how, because they were in the legislation. Fairly obviously it shouldn't be just octopus, there are rather lots of cephalopods it ought to be, and there's some quite good work now trying to go on to which other invertebrates. A lot of the decapod crustacea probably ought to be there, because it's so difficult to prove these things, but the evidence suggests that they may have the sort of capacity for what's usually referred to now as sentience that we think vertebrates do. I mean, frankly, they're brighter by a long way and more capable of feeling pleasures and pain, I think, without much doubt, than a lot of amphibians.
I'm wondering if the Wiggles had anything to do
The what?
with it. The Wiggles.
Wiggles.
The Wiggles is an Australian children's
I wouldn't rule,
entertainers that have the star attraction is not.
I would rule nothing out in UK law. So, thank you.
Joe.
Going back to your comment about the enormous amount of evidence that it was taking on the advisory committee for not fruiting processes, and this process is still going on and increasing. And I was just wondering how you felt about, on the one hand, I suppose you were commenting that you've actually got a much greater standard of proof for one type of product than you have for another. On the other hand, you might argue that people who hold passionate views deserve to have their views tested by evidence, and sometimes that requires more evidence if their views are more passionately held. So where do you...
Right, to give my slightly more academic answer, the conclusion that I personally reached was that it was possible to defend the notion that not eating, whether wittingly or otherwise, GM food, not eating it, was core to a person being as a person. In that sense, it was comparable to a vegetarian. Not for many people, but for some. For reasons I might happen to think were more difficult to defend in GM food than I would in vegetarianism, but that's the case. Given that, actually, the important thing is not extra safety checks, it's just the clear labelling, isn't it? You know, that's the crucial thing, and it's not a very exciting answer to give. And I don't believe labelling solves everything, it does not. But in this particular case, in my view, when you've got to a certain acceptability of safety, and I do realise again, you can never be sure about what about 20 years ahead. Well, you couldn't then, you can now, because we've had 250 million people in the USA eating GM foods for 20 years. Although those people occasionally point out that might explain a lot. That's not fair to me, it's a throwaway joke. So we know that there are not likely to be long-term food safety issues, and I think it just ought to have been good quality labelling. So frankly, I think the USA is right in front of the WTO on all these court cases.
John?
Yeah, I've got a slightly frivolous comment, but then a serious question. The frivolous comment is that the height of the broad discussions on that committee, I was having lunch with my wife tomorrow, sort of more popular lunch committees in Exeter, there's a big sign over the counter that said, in order to maintain public choice, we have avoided GM foods. And you could not understand. I had no choice.
Yes.
I wanted to eat.
Yes, exactly. There was a time when I know, you used to be able to get certain GM foods in this country. You could get them quite easily imported. It's quite difficult now to even get them imported, actually. I used to carry around marshmallows that I'd occasionally offer in public debates to Friends of the Earth colleagues.
I'm tomato puree.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Mine exploded eventually, I'll be honest. Have you still got yours?
I netted somebody for a lecture, you never get back.
Yeah, no, my Safeway tomato puree sadly eventually exploded for reasons which I think got nothing to do with GM.
But my serious
Yes.
question or comment is that, as you say, there's some practices, there's also an assumption often about religious people, and I'm always fascinated when my students are doing an assignment for me, and they will make a bland statement about Christians' belief.
Yes.
And I write, is this all of us in the margin? And
Yeah.
does that happen to you as, if you like, the professional Christian in the community? Are you assumed to have a particular standpoint? Like, it's assumed that Christians are against democracy?
Well done. I think it's certainly assumed that Christians, it's often assumed, well, there are some people, of course, for whom religion is just so irrelevant in their minds that they're not even very interested in what. It's just sufficient to exclude you from consideration, be quite serious here, until they get to know you. That's the point. And then, of course, it gets harder and harder to defend the notion that this person is a complete idiot, because he doesn't appear to be, apart from some of his jokes, a complete idiot in most other ways. I mean, Richard Dawkins and I have known each other for donkey's years, and he still finds me a very unsettling person, because part of him knows that I'm reasonably bright, but he just can't understand how somebody who's reasonably bright can apparently, and of course even more with someone like Bishop of Oxford, he writes, as many people know, quite overtly, in a completely schizoid way about some people whom he knows rather well. But as you say, the serious point behind that, I think, is just something about, like any good education. I mean, you'll get the same simply with people making assumptions about scientists. And so, by your presence, by your being, by the amount of time you and particularly many other people give in talks and talking to people, it all helps just to reduce those sort of generalisations and stereotypes.
Well, my question was almost identical. I think you just answered it. I was going to say, when you sit on these committees, going back to your first two slides, do they see you wearing your professor hat, or do they see you wearing your reverend?
I don't tend to be anything like as light-hearted as I have been deliberately this late afternoon. I would try, because these are proper high-status committees, most people, half of them won't know you when you first meet them, so I would genuinely talk about expertise, sort of thing where my locus of expertise is. But then, of course, as all of us know, from whether it's governing bodies in schools or any sort of meeting, everybody gradually relaxes and you get to know each other and get to know the real person a bit better. So to repeat, I've deliberately been a bit more light-hearted here than I would in a first meeting, obviously, of one of these things. But equally, I would try and avoid them just thinking, oh crumbs, it's going to be turgid whenever Michael says something because he's wearing an ethical hat or religious hat.
you have one, Martin? No. Yeah.
You mentioned that you often find yourself as the one ethicist on expert committees and such like. Would you care to make recommendations for what the best kind of committee is to make judgments on ethical matters?
Well, I wouldn't have more than one. I wouldn't necessarily think me, he says modestly. But you don't need huge numbers. I have a real belief the crucial thing is to be interdisciplinary on these committees. That's the crucial thing, interdisciplinary. So if it's a technical committee, it's got to be dominated by people with the technical expertise. We then get into a rather interesting academic argument about what is expertise. As some people know, a lot of the medical charities have substantively changed the membership of their grant-giving bodies because they now have many more people who themselves are patients or have immediate family members who are patients. There was a time when some doctors would have thought that's putting lots of lay people on these committees, but it's not. It's putting people with a different sort of expertise. So I like decision-making technical committees to be filled with people with expertise. It's just I think we've now got a rather healthy broadening of the notion of what is expertise. Ethics is slightly difficult because, as Neil pointed out again last night, there are several different frameworks, and some ethicists are very firm about only their framework being acceptable. I don't quite know why, but this does seem to be the case. Well, I think I do know why, but it seems to be the case, honestly, particularly for utilitarians. I happen to think the utilitarian framework is the most useful one to start with in public decision making. I don't see it trumping everything, but it's the most useful one to start with because all ethical frameworks are concerned with consequences and with goods and with some sort of maximization of good. It's just that the other ones are not only concerned with that, so it's a good place to start. But there are some, I mean, I don't think I can name names, but some of the best academic ethicists we have in this country, and it's not just utilitarians, and we have one deontologist as well, you couldn't put them on a reasonably high-level committee. You just couldn't. Because they wouldn't be able to work. These things have to be consensual. There has to be compromise at times. I happen to think compromise, 8 times at a time, you go along with it, and then occasionally you have the sort of here I stand. And that's much more likely to be accepted if the previous 4 or 5 times you've compromised.
Dennis had a question. Maybe it ought to be the last one.
Oh, it was a sort of related question actually. I just wondered, I mean, sometimes government committees can be a little, let's say they lack variety, or they can have a tendency to have certain people on the books who get invited back and, you know, get around. No personal comment. Absolutely. I just wondered, what was your impression that actually there was a concerted effort to try and draw a fairly broad spectrum of people? Now, you partly answered that in your ethics answer, that actually the ethicists are sort of excluded themselves by perhaps not being such useful people for those kind of committees. But more broadly,
I have to say, I think I've only been doing this for a certain number of years, so I can't remember what was going on 30 years ago, but I think there's a real effort now. These things post-Nolan, as you all know, they're all actually publicly advertised, much more so. You still get, the fork, I'd also go to apply for it, and somebody suggests you might apply for it. So it's that sort of scenario still. But they're very rigorous. They make a real effort now with reference to things like gender, ethnicity, age, spread of expertise. They do try, I think, quite hard. And that's partly because they know it's the first thing you'll be criticised for when you produce the report 18 months later, if it's been a load of identical looking people. So I think things are trying that way.
Right, well, I think perhaps we will draw to a close because this gives us 1/4 of an hour before the gala dinner, just to breathe and think of some questions, folks. I don't know whether we've got many as yet, but we have got a few, but I think we'll do it more. So do think of your questions for the panel and put them in there, and we'll round up for dinner in 1/4 of an hour's time. Thank you. I think perhaps we will draw to a close because this gives